Hey, it's Enloser. Today's story is very disturbing and quite scary, so I suggest you buckle up. Seriously, especially if you're in a car, please do buckle up. It's safer that way. But even if you're not driving, this story will shake you, so make sure you buckle up. Dr. Arthur Duperrault was a successful optometrist, and he had planned for the family to have this very beautiful and expensive vacation. Now, they'd been saving for years to be able to go to this vacation. Now, Dr. Arthur himself was a very experienced and accomplished sailor himself. He had traversed the waters of Green Bay many times, but for this specific trip, he would be hiring one of his friends to sail the boat. So Dr. Arthur, his wife Jean, and their 3 children, they pack up and they hit the road. They drive down to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Dad goes and meets the owner of the 60-foot, which is 18 meters long, ketch called Bluebell. Destination is Bahamas. Dr. Arthur had sailed there before during the World War II. But as said, this time he hires a very well-known local yachtsman, as well as Dr. Arthur's friend, the 44-year-old Julian Harvey, that would be skipping the ship for $100 a day. Harvey's 6th wife, the 34-year-old ex-stewardess and an aspiring writer, Mary Dean Harvey, would join them as a cook on their trip. So on the 8th of November, Wednesday, in 1961, they set out and leave the port to travel to locations such as Bimini and Sandy Point, eventually ending up in the Bahamas. Terry Jo, Arthur's 11-year-old daughter, spends time with her siblings, snorkeling and swimming in the crystal clear waters of the Bahamas, eating fresh seafood from the locals. This is quite literally a vacation of a lifetime. And even though short, it was one that would be memorable. On Sunday night, the 12th of November, the Bluebell begins the journey back to Florida. Terry, she gets sleepy, and even though everybody's in the cockpit hanging around, she sees her siblings are napping there and decides to go back down to her cabin where she wanted to sleep. She normally shares the cabin with her sister, but because her sister and her brother are napping there in the cockpit, she doesn't really want to wake them up. So she tells everyone that she was gonna go down the deck and enter her cabin where she'd be sleeping, and she makes her way down there. Everyone else remains in the cockpit. Now the adults are enjoying the last bit of their vacation. Everybody's relaxed. They're eating chicken cacciatore and a salad and just having some drinks. At around 11 p.m., Terry Jo wakes up to what she believes is the scream of her brother. She's not certain for a moment because she thinks that it might have been a dream, but when she awakens and she listens very closely, she can hear from outside her door, "Help, Daddy, help!" No doubt it was her brother Brian screaming. Terry fears for her life. She's not certain what's going on, and she's too afraid to get out of her bed and go look what was going on. Paralyzed for many minutes in her bed, she tries to listen again if there was any other sound, but no other sound from her brother comes. So she's hoping that she maybe imagined it, or she heard things when she awoke from her dreams, still being part of her dreams. And then eventually she builds up the courage to get out of her bed and go look what that sound was. She opens the door from her cabin to the outside, and what she sees brings her to complete shock. It's her mother and her brother lying dead on the ground in a pool of blood mixed with some water. For a moment, she's unable to breathe, unable to comprehend the image that's before her. With a shock, she starts walking past them, shaking like crazy, and she starts to go up to the deck to find out what had happened. in hopes that the rest of her family was still there, one part of her is still not certain whether this is all a dream or reality. As she ascends to the upper part of the deck, there's very dimly lit lights illuminating the area, and then she sees Julian Harvey's dark figure approaching her. He has this very menacing way of walking, and his face is completely cold and bitter. Somehow, Terry is able to speak, and the only words coming out from her mouth is, "What happened?" Harvey realizes the sound that's coming from the side and immediately turns to see Terry. For a brief moment, the both keep eye contact. In Harvey's hands is a rifle. He doesn't shoot her, but immediately he snaps out of that moment of shock and just pushes her back down to the deck, yelling at her, "Just go back down there, don't come out." Terry, in fear, goes back down, not sure what's happening, whether they're in danger and that Harvey person is trying to save them somehow. She then starts hearing hammering noises. When the hammering sounds appear, Terry gets even more scared. Immediately she runs back to her cabin, and as she's passing the dead bodies of her family, she's closing her eyes. Once she arrives in her own cabin, she goes back into her bed and huddles down there, trying to bring up the sheets as a sort of protection layer. In fear and almost in tears, she's praying that nothing further happens and that they can get out of there alive somehow. Then she hears sloshing sounds of water. Soon enough, it comes very close from her room. There's oily bilge water creeping inside of her room. She gets rid of the sheets and watches as water is filling up into her room when Harvey's figure appears at the door frame. She can see his black shade, the shadowy figure, because light is hitting him from behind, but she can't make out the facial expression or what he's doing there. This is a very brief moment, but for Terry it feels like it's been more than minutes. Harvey then, for whatever reason, turns around and goes back up the deck. Terry realizes that water is coming into the room, and she understands that this is an emergency. She can't stay in this room. It's going to be filled with water. Her survival instinct kicks in, and even though she's scared of what's up there, she decides to once again go back up the deck. So she walks outside and she passes the dead bodies that are almost floating in water now because water has filled up the rooms immediately. When she gets upstairs, she sees Harvey, who had launched a dinghy and a life raft and was getting ready to abort the ship. She yells to him,
"Is the ship sinking?"
Harvey just nods and then gives Terry a sort of rope into her hands. Terry isn't sure what the rope she's holding onto is, and in fear it immediately slips away anyway. It was the line connecting to the dinghy, and once it slips, the dinghy also immediately just slips out of the ship into the waters. When Harvey sees that his escape vehicle, the dinghy, is floating away slowly, he panics. For a moment, he looks at Terry and then looks back at the dinghy. He looks at Terry again and just shakes his head and tells her to just stay put here, and jumps into the water. He dives into the water, chases the dinghy that's now floating away slowly. Terry Joe, frightened, looks from behind him and then watches Harvey as he disappears in the dark sea. She's fearing for her life now because the boat is constantly shaking, filling with water, and it's literally about to sink completely. She looked around where Harvey was tinkering in hopes of finding anything similar to what Harvey had chased down. And then, to her luck, she finds a cork and rope life raft. This was a very small life raft, and only to be used to really pull people into the boat, or in case of serious emergencies, not to really float on the sea or travel at all. Of course, she wasn't really aware of what she had found, but she kept tinkering around it, trying to pull things, and she was somehow able to throw that sort of small life raft thing onto the sea. The ship was almost completely sinking anyway, and it wasn't really high up anymore. She was very close to the sea. She, in that moment, doesn't really think of what she needs to do next. It's all happening so fast. It's this sort of survival instinct in that moment. She jumps into the sea after the raft that she'd just thrown out. Her heart pounding like crazy. She tried and swam towards the raft that wasn't really moving too far away and climbed on it. It was very small. She couldn't even lie on it, so she almost sat on the side of it, and it felt somewhat clumsy, so she tried not to move too much in order not to fall off of it. As she looked back to the ship that was sinking, she was hoping that somehow her father and the rest of her family had managed to escape the ship, not aware that almost all of her family was left behind. The sea was deciding in which direction she was going. She had no control of the raft whatsoever. Sometimes it was the wind deciding which direction she goes, and sometimes it felt like there was no wind at all, but big waves were coming and pushing her in a certain direction. She had to clench really hard and hold on to the sides of the small raft-like thing in order not to fall, and she was always afraid of falling. The sun rose, and Terry's heart began pounding with excitement. It was feeling refreshing and hopeful after that long night of the sadness and fear and the darkness. Now the sun was beating down on her very heavily, and her skin had started to turn completely red, being itchy and hurting almost. Even her bones were aching. She was also very thirsty and hungry too. Since there was no food around, she could drink some of the seawater in hopes of helping with her thirst even a little bit. So in a moment where it wasn't too much windy or even wavy and the sea was calm, she tried to reach the sea and grab some of the seawater to drink. Almost immediately, she puked it back out because it was so salty. When it would get dark, she would try to lie down on the raft even a little bit, as much as she can, to get some shut-eye. The thirst and the hunger and the insane amounts of tiredness that she was feeling in her body was making her feel drowsy and sleepy. So without really wanting, she felt the need of sleeping. She would fall asleep for a very brief moment, and almost immediately she'd wake up, still clenching, from the sides of the raft, because in her dreams she'd have this feeling of falling down from it. So it was difficult for her to sleep even for minutes, let alone hours. She'd get these very short, quick naps in between, but every single time she'd wake up in fear of falling down, and it would be even worse than before. Sometimes it would feel like something was moving from under her. There were no visible waves, but the raft would just shake all of a sudden, and she could almost see something from underneath her just swimming away. She wasn't sure what it was, but she was thinking that maybe it was just some fish or dolphins, and she would just not even think about it really. The only thing that kept her really company at night were the bright stars up ahead. When she looks up to the sky, she sees these beautiful colors, millions of stars just shining back at her. She even saw, and maybe didn't understand it at that time, the Milky Way. Everything else was pitch black. She didn't know in which direction she was going. She didn't know where she was going. What was around her? Nothing. Complete darkness, along with the sounds of the sea and the waves hitting each other. And from the waves and the sounds of the water, sometimes she would get splashes on her face, and she could feel that the water was going a little bit crazy, so she would try and hold on even tighter when that happened. What she might have been thinking as she was drifting on the sea was this: "Oh, so cold it is. I'm so cold, Mommy. Where are you? Daddy? I wonder if you're still alive. Or are you all left behind? God, please, if you can hear me, save me and my family. The stars are so beautiful, shining on me, shining onto the sea. What was that sound? Oh, the waves have started to become faster again. Will I make it out alive? Oh, Terry. What's this sound? Is that the sound of a fish? The sea is talking to me. I want to sleep. God, if I sleep, will you protect me so I don't fall off? 3.5 days pass in this confusing and completely lonely state for Terry Jo. For her, it felt like weeks. And then suddenly, there were screams. The sun was there for a moment, and then suddenly it wasn't. She could hear screams, and then she couldn't. She couldn't even see clearly anymore. All of her body was hurting, burning, and aching. She remembers vaguely a big, strong man approaching her in a sort of boat, and then grabbing her, lifting her up, and putting her beside him. Next thing she wakes up, she sees a much bigger boat. She's in something much larger now. A man is examining her, and there's many people gathered around her. Now, the man who had picked her up was a Greek freighter, Captain Theo. When he realized that what they had seen out in the sea wasn't a shipping vessel, but a small raft carrying a blonde little girl dressed in a white cotton blouse and pink corduroy slacks, leaning backward, just waving feebly, almost about to pass out, he immediately ordered the engines to be stopped completely and lowered the raft to go save the little girl. Sharks were circling around the cork float that Terry was sitting on, so the people in the ship were yelling out for Terry not to get off the little raft, not to jump into the water and just stay put. Those were the screams that Terry had heard when she was in this sort of trance state. Now, she was given a spare cabin where she'd be taken care of. The crew immediately realized that she was super confused, incoherent, and unable to speak. She was just slurring words. They gave her water as well as orange juice, and then also some food. Salt was sponged from her body via the help of wet towels. They applied Vaseline to her lips because it had dried out so much that it was chapped and just bleeding almost. After they had taken care of her a little bit, she was feeling somewhat better and regained most of her consciousness and was able to identify herself as the 11-year-old Terry Jo Duperrault. She told everyone what had happened, that she was in this ship abroad and that it was sinking, and then that she pulled out this little life raft of sorts and gotten on it, and that it had been days or maybe weeks that she was on the sea, just floating. Her ability to speak, though, quickly waned, and she wasn't able to speak any further. The crew kept asking questions to identify her further, though, and she was only able to give hand gestures and maybe shake her head a little bit. And eventually, her body gave up completely, and she went into this semi-comatose state where she wasn't aware of anything that was going on. It was basically an unconscious state of herself. Now, the crew wasn't able to retrieve the cork float that Terry was on, but a member of the Coast Guard was able to find the cork float several days later in the ocean and retrieve it. Once it was retrieved, it started falling apart immediately and disintegrate. Now, the captain of the Greek Theo immediately informed the United States Coast Guard of their discovery of the child and her medical predicament and situation. A rescue helicopter was sent to the area where it retrieved Terry Jo, who was suffering from severe sunburn, dehydration, and exposure. She was airlifted to a nearby hospital in a very critical condition. 3 hours later, after she was airlifted to a hospital in Miami, Terry Jo regained consciousness, and she began slowly recuperating, feeling better. But it would take at least 2 more days until she was able to speak to the police or the Coast Guard as to what had happened, how she got there, and what took place in the boat that never would have been recovered. 12:35 p.m., the 13th of November, a crew member aboard the oil tanker Gulf Lion observed a man frantically waving and yelling. He was drifting in their direction on a dinghy and shouting out, "Help, I have a dead body on board." They pulled the man aboard and they observed the deceased body of a red-haired girl. On her was this yellow life jacket. The man identified himself as Julian Harvey, the skipper of the Bluebell. Harvey explained that approximately 8:30 p.m. the previous day, his small vessel was hit by a sudden, strong thunderstorm at a location between Abaco Islands and Great Stirrup Cay that caused the Bluebell to rapidly keel over and the main mast to snap, evidently piercing the ship's hull. According to Harvey, he was separated completely by everyone else on board of the ship by this falling mast, which then resulted in a loose rigging, which then pulled down the mizzen. These are quite technical terms, but mainly he's talking that he was separated and the ship was literally sinking. He attempted to retrieve a wire cutter to empty out the space on the deck, but then a sudden fire broke out, and then he was unable to rescue his wife or any of the other passengers. Forced to abandon the ketch on a dinghy, he realized that there's a body floating on the water, and then he pulled it on board. He tried reviving the child, but at no luck was he able to do so. The child had passed away long ago. It was the 7-year-old Renee, sister of Terry. Harvey had decided to keep the body on the raft out of respect. Now, nearly everyone who heard Harvey's story found something off about it. To begin with, the crew members didn't think it was natural for Harvey to be that calm when they found him. He had just lost his clients as well as his wife, and yet he seemed so calm and collected about it, only telling what had happened. Harold Pegg, the owner of the Bluebell, argued that Harvey claiming it had to do with the mast failing was preposterous, that it didn't make sense because the ketch had recently been inspected and cleared. There were no issues, and something like that should or could not have potentially even happened. Even an old friend of Harvey, James Boozer, found that there were different iterations of Harvey's story and many holes that he couldn't quite understand. Harvey had served in World War II as a bomber pilot. He even managed to pull off a dangerous test flight in the Korean War. Yet his peers in the military had noted his tendency towards ditching missions due to engine failure. Now, by the end of his military career, even his supporters were saying that his nerves were shot. This fact was made much clearer if anybody looked at Harvey, who now had quite an obvious facial tic and an ever so growing stutter. Then there were the wives. Mary Dean Jordan was his 6th wife. Harvey had this tendency of wooing women and immediately getting married to them, only to be with them for a very short amount of time, and then hastily divorcing them with sentences such as, "I don't love you anymore." His affairs were legend in the Air Force Base in Florida, where he was staying with his 2nd or potentially 3rd wife, and this was in 1949. However, the tales of his past wives turned darker. One rainy night, Harvey is driving back from the movies, and in the car, he has his wife and his mother-in-law with him. Now, as he describes this accident, the car suddenly just swerved on a bridge, rolled over on its side, and then swerved down into the bayou. The car sank, and Harvey was the only one who survived. As bystanders dove into the water to find the remaining passengers, Miss Harvey and her mother, Harvey almost calmly described his escape, telling people around him that he was able to jump out of the car while it was in mid-air. And he seemed to be almost bragging as he was telling the story. Evidence later showed that this had not been the case, that the car door was surely not opened mid-air. Not only this, but Harvey didn't even attempt to save any of his relatives. He didn't even seem broken up about their losses. And soon enough, he cashed in his wife's life insurance policy. It was also later established that Bluebell was not the first boat to sink under Harvey's control. In fact, twice before, Harvey had filed insurance claims of destroyed boats, all of which had somehow ruled in his favor, even though evidence was uncertain and not quite clear on how the boats were destroyed really. Later, friends of his came forward, admitting that Harvey had told them that in the first wreck, he steered the boat on an obstacle on purpose. And in the second case, he flat out admitted that he set the boat on fire. But all of this was unknown to the Coast Guard that would interview him 3 days later of the incident. He just repeated the same story that he had told his rescuers at the time. Even though there were holes, there was no evidence against him, and nobody could say anything because no one had seen anything. Let's look at his holes in the story. For one, the idea of a mast plunging straight onto the boat was very unlikely. Masts broken by extreme winds would bend over and not just completely collapse. Furthermore, when the mast failure happened, Harvey allegedly told Arthur to steer the ship as he went to look for these cable cutters. And in that moment, a fire broke out in the engine room. And then Harvey screams to Arthur to continue steering the ship towards the wind, basically the wind blowing on them. So to the opposite direction. This also didn't make sense to anybody because, first of all, if there was fire, you should never be going against the wind because the wind would then cause a sort of fan effect, making the fire spread faster. And the idea that a Navy veteran, an experienced sailor like Arthur, would continue in that direction also didn't make sense. There was also the fact that on a nearby island, on a lighthouse, nobody had seen any fire. Harvey also didn't even attempt to go towards that island, even though it was in visible distance. Another quite odd detail was that Harvey, for some reason, hadn't even thought about using the flares that were literally in the dinghy, that he could have set out to the sky, flared up the sky of where the shipwreck was, and people could have come to rescue. So just as Harvey was wrapping up his testimony to the investigators, he was finished with his story, a captain of the Coast Guard rushed into the room. They all look up to him, curious as to why he suddenly interrupted this interrogation, and then the Coast Guard tells him the news that they'd found a survivor. This was the 17th of November. It was literally midway or towards the end of Harvey's interrogation. The Coast Guard continues to explain that it was Terry Joe, a survivor from the boat that Harvey was on. When he also found out that Terry Joe's condition was improving and that she was saved the previous day, Harvey exclaimed, "Oh my God," in a very not so shocked but almost fearful manner. And then he calmly added, "Isn't that wonderful?" Immediately after he said this, he excused himself from the interrogation. He said that he was tired and he wanted to rest and maybe continue the next day. His request was granted. Harvey then drove a short distance to the Biscayne Boulevard, where he checked into the Sandman Motel under the assumed name of John Monroe, paying cash. The Mind, "You fool of a man, how could you have let this happen? Oh, what a grave mistake it was to let her live. They'll get me now, surely. They'll take me down. Oh yes, in prison I'll rot just like a sliced apple left behind. And did they not slice me, cut me up with guilt and agony. I killed for this country, killed the innocent, filled with regrets. I shall burn in hell, but so shall they. I should have ended her when I had the chance. Should have taken her out, shot with a bullet. These waters, I thought, would have been wrathful enough. Wrong. I pitied her. No, I pitied myself. I did not want any more blood on these forsaken hands. How could I have killed her? So young, so full of life, and so much to live for still. Oh, that poor family, so full of joy. How can I live on? I can't. It all must end. He then wrote a 2-page letter to leave behind, and then he ended his life with a razor blade in the bathroom of the motel. His body was found by a maid 2 hours later due to this extremely foul smell. The note that he left behind was addressed to an ex-military friend of his. There were no explanations or apologies in the letter, but the letter ended in these words: I got too tired and too nervous. I couldn't stand it any longer. I'm a nervous wreck and I just can't continue. I'm going out now. I guess I either don't like life or don't know what to do with it. The note also requested the recipient to take care of his 14-year-old boy named Lance. His last wish was that he be buried at sea. Though not certain, it was concluded that Harvey had planned to kill his wife for her insurance money of $20,000. And if she died accidentally, that would have yielded to double that amount, which would be $40,000. I calculated that, and it roughly makes around more than $500,000 today. So $500,000-ish today. It is believed that as Harvey was attempting to get rid of his wife, he was caught by Arthur Duperrault, either during the act of his murder or while he was disposing of her body. Harvey then felt like he had no other choice but to kill him and his family as well, those who had witnessed his murders. Following the loss of her family, Terry Jo returned to the Green Bay to live with her father's sister, her grandmother, and a few cousins of hers. She refused to part with the blouse and the slacks that she was wearing on the day of her rescue. She refuses to be viewed as a victim and has changed her name now. Terry Jo later even married and bore 3 children of her own. In 2010, she released her memoirs, Alone, Orphaned in the Ocean. It was co-authored with psychologist and survival expert Richard Logan. In the afterword, this is what she says: what I want to stress to all who read this book is never give up. Always have hope and try to look on the bright side of things. Be positive, be trusting, and try to go with the flow. Have compassion. Give of yourself to those in need and be loving and kind. I believe that what you give comes back to you. And that marks the end of our video today. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Please make sure you subscribe and like the video so we can grow as a channel and I can continue making these videos. I read every single comment. Write down what you think. Should we add background music, for instance? Would you like that? Or is it better with no music? What would you like to see in the upcoming videos? What kind of topics can we look into? Are there any stories or true crime scenarios that have happened? Please do mind that I respect everything that has happened and the deceased and the details that I add with these thoughts and the thing that's so-called the mind. I am just trying to get into the mind and the thought process of the people involved in the story. Sometimes it can be the victim and sometimes it's the attacker or the murderer or basically just the antagonist. Is that the right word? And I do not intend to put any words in their minds or in their mouths. That part is all purely fictional. It's to add some sort of suspense, a better understanding of what might have been going on in the mind of the people themselves. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you so much once again. Enjoy the very creepy and eerie ukulele song at the end of this video. and stay safe and stay eerie. Tried to walk home last night, really thought I'd be fine, but then a sudden thump behind. Wait, is that an alien? What was that sound I heard? Jane, please stop fooling around. What do you mean wash the dishes? Do you realize what time it is? I'm getting the creeps again. Look at these goosebumps on my skin. If I'm not back by 8, the delivery guy probably did it. Now I must fade in the dark, get away from everyone. Oh Jane, I'm so afraid. I'm begging you to stay. Is someone watching me as I'm wide asleep? Getting those goosebumps again. Wait, am I peeing? I'm so scared that I'm peeing.